Welcome to Shop Talk, everyone. I'm Brandy.
And I'm James, and we talk about all things related to cross-cultural workers and mental health.
Thanks for joining us, and welcome to Season 4. Glad you guys are here today. We have a repeat guest today, so drum roll, please. Ted Wueste is with us today. So welcome, Ted.
Thank you. It's a joy, for sure.
Very happy to have you back. We're going to talk with Ted about attachment theory, and how that can inform our relationship and our understanding of our relationship with God. So really, really light stuff today we're going to get into. But I want to introduce Ted first. For those of you who may not remember Ted from our first episode with him, or are just being introduced to him now, let me tell you a little bit about Ted. Ted serves as the founder and director of Spiritual Formation Society in Arizona. For the last 30 years, he has served in various ministry capacities, with 20 of those years serving in pastoral ministry. After serving as an associate pastor, Ted planted a church that he pastored for 9 years, and then served as an executive pastor of spiritual formation for 6 years. Ted designed and taught in a spiritual formation program at Phoenix Seminary for 7 years, and now enjoys the ministry of spiritual direction, retreat leading, and teaching. Ted is the coordinator for a spiritual direction training program in Arizona, SELA, and serves as senior faculty. He's written several books on the spiritual journey, as well as devotionals and study guides that many have found very helpful. At the end, in our show notes, whenever we publish a podcast, we will add some links of how you can get in touch with Ted directly and learn more about his spiritual formation ministry. There you have it. And we're glad to talk to you today. Ted talked at our staff care and well-being retreat a little over a year ago in Spain. It was really, really helpful and refreshing and informative for all of us, I guess.
I'm glad you're here to talk about attachment theory, just because both as therapists and navigating relationships with people, we see evidence of how we developed our attachment styles in our upbringing and our kids impacts our lives today, and how we relate with each other's, whether it's between spouses or kids, or as often we are engaged in organizational health, how we engage with coworkers. And certainly it makes sense that also impacts how we relate to God. So how did you get into this topic? Because this is definitely drifting a little towards the psychology field, which is, where Brandy and I sit. But I'm curious to know how this piqued your interest.
Well, I think, as some friends of mine and I often say, it's like attachment theory over the last couple of years is having its moment in the sun. It's been around for a long, long time, right? If you go online, social media, it's like everybody's talking about attachment theory, and it feels like there's a lot of, amateur psychologists out there talking about attachment theory. And it's kind of like other things like Enneagram. People read, half a book, and then they start commenting like they're an expert on social media. And I think with attachment theory, that's kind of what's been happening the last couple of years. And I think the reason it's become so much in the popular conversation is because it is so helpful to understand, even just very basically, what's happening with attachment theory. So I think as I was seeing all this conversation, I have a degree in psychology. My undergrad is in psychology, so it wasn't anything that was totally new to me. But I think watching all the discussion and seeing the interest in it kind of renewed for me some interest and study and really understanding, okay, what's going on here? And I think I would not say I'm an expert in attachment theory by any means. You guys would be more that than me. But I think I began to process through, okay, what does this mean in terms of how we're relating to God? And that's been the primary place where I've spent time. And then last year, our ministry here in Arizona, our conference was on attachment theory and our life with God, because everybody's talking about it. So why not talk about it in terms of what does this mean as it relates to our life with God and our relationship with God?
Ted, I wonder if we could take a few steps back and just unpack what is attachment theory for those people listening who may not have as much familiarity with it.
So, I mean, it's a theory that's been around for quite a while, decades, and then it's kind of been commented on more fully over the last 20 years, and then again, kind of having that popular moment in the sun right now. But attachment, and I'm going to read this because it was probably first really discussed by John Bowlby or Bowlby.
Bowlby.
You know the pronunciation, Bowlby, yeah. And he observed attachment as being, and here was his quote, a lasting logical connection between human beings. And so the theory then is that early in our lives, we experience or don't experience in some way attachment to our primary caregiver, which then affects the way that we tend to experience attachment through the rest of our lives. And so in some ways there's a simplicity to understanding that we can all understand, oh, the way that I relate to my caregivers, my parents, or it could be grandparents or whatever, but the way that I experience connection with them then affects the way that I connect with others throughout my life. And then I think by extension, then the way that we connect with God. So there is a simplicity to that. And of course, the way that people explore that and understand it in their own lives reveals a lot of complexities and depth and layers. But that's how I would understand it and talk about it in a very initial way.
There are a lot of different ways to view, when you think about counseling and relationships, there are a lot of different ways to view how we become the way that we are and how we develop our worldviews and things like that. And for me, attachment just makes sense. These early key critical relationships that we have in our lives that, of course, they inform how our minds form and the way we relate to the world and how that forms too. So I really like attachment as a lens of understanding ourselves and understanding all of our relationships.
And some theologians have made the connection that when God talks about love and his love for us, it is an attachment love. It is a connecting love. In fact, the Old Testament word that's used over and over again for God's love for us is often translated in English as loving kindness or steadfast love. And it's the Hebrew word chesed, which is a connecting, pursuing, initiating relational dynamic. And so many have made the connection that when we're talking about attachment, we're really talking about something that's a part of God's created design and how he made us. And it all kind of starts to fit together, because if you think about Jesus saying all the stuff in scripture, all the commands come back to loving God and loving your neighbor, it's like, oh, it comes back to this issue of attachment. And because we're made in God's image, God being Trinitarian, Father, Son, and Spirit, there's an attachment, a connection, a bond between Father, Son, and Spirit. And we were made and formed to have the ability to connect and bond and relate in those same kind of ways. So I think in many ways, the idea of attachment theory is giving people a better handle, at least it can give people a better handle on what God's talking about when he says love. Because often we think about love as some amorphous, indefinable sort of thing that's like magic. And there is an element where love is mysterious. And how do you can't define it or get your hands around it. But yet I think attachment theory is incredibly helpful for someone who's seeking to walk with God to get some definition and some handles on it.
Not to brag, but it's either really cool or really cringe. But I have Hesed. My husband and I have Hesed tattooed on our ankles. So when he was studying Hebrew, when we first married, we thought we'd be really cool. So there you have it.
Hopefully spelled right.
I don't know. I don't speak Hebrew.
In Hebrew?
Mm-hmm.
I wonder, Ted, if you could start with just kind of unpacking the different attachment styles and what they mean in relationships, and then we could start looking at how those different attachment styles impact our relationship to God.
So, in a very basic way, there's either a secure attachment that we experience, and we have a secure attachment style where we are able to connect with others and bond with others in such a way that we experience a security and feeling seen, safe, known. And so there's secure and then insecure, where in some way our connection and our bonding is experienced in insecure ways. And we can unpack some specific ways that there's an insecure style. And I think it's, as I've been interacting with this, it's helpful to realize that none of us have completely perfect, secure attachment styles all the time in every relationship. And none of us have probably completely insecure where there's never, so we're all probably kind of a mixture, and different relationships could bring up different things. For some of us, we've had really messed up relationships with authority in our life. So every time there's an authority or we have a boss, oh my gosh, that just brings up all this insecurity and an insecure kind of connection with that person. Or so anyway, you could kind of see how that would flow out from there. And then when you think about the insecure, the framework that's been most helpful for me, and this is just one person's way of fleshing this out. Crispin Mayfield, who's a therapist, wrote a book, Attached to God, and he described the insecure attachment styles as either a shutdown of our emotions, where as opposed to feeling what we feel, we learned that if I'm going to connect and feel any sense of security, I have to totally shut down my emotions. So that would be one. Another one would be a shame-filled emotional style, to where, or connection or attachment style, where if I'm going to have any sense, and I say sense of feeling secure because it's not really a secure attachment, but feeling secure is if I take on shame and I experience a sense of shame, that makes me feel connected or attached. And then the third one would be a fear-based kind of attachment style, where I'm always trying to attend to what's going on and make sure that everything's okay. And what's coming up in me is fear. So that, of course, has connections to the way that we relate to one another, the way that we respond to one another.
In your work through spiritual formation, do you tend to see more of one or particular type of insecure attachment when you're teaching this and relating to people?
No, I think all of them. I feel like for me, I can see times where any of those insecure attachment styles might pop up for me personally. And so I think it's just one of the really difficult things about it is that when we've been formed with an insecure attachment style or multiple insecure attachment styles, it's really hard for us to think that's not normal. It's really hard for us not to think, well, that's just how you relate to people. So if I have that fear based or anxiety based attachment style, I just think I'm always supposed to be kind of hyper vigilant in relationships and always making sure that people are okay, and always, and that's just how you relate. Or, I think with the shutdown kind of attachment style, I just think I'm not supposed to feel things. I just have to be, quote, strong, and not let difficult emotions come to the surface. And so usually we've been formed in ways that um, they make sense to us. And so I think more so than seeing any one particular style, I think it's probably more people deepening in their awareness, and even their willingness to be aware that they have an insecure attachment style. I think sometimes on the popular level, it's really easy to look at other people and go, oh, well, James has an insecure attachment style because he does X, Y, Z. Or, oh, Brandy, oh my goodness, look at her. But for me to say, well, I don't know exactly what's going on with Brandy and James, but I know for me, here's what's happening inside of me. And that is humbling, I think sometimes hard,
Scary.
scary. It doesn't happen fast or easily, and then there's layers to it.
I mean, so often the lens at which we view the world is so based on our experiences. I mean, this is the interpersonal neurobiology aspect of all of our learning has happened in the context of other people. So that attachment development has been growing and developing through every moment of our life, because nearly every moment when we're awake is in contact with other people, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I know a lot of parents hear about attachment styles and then they kind of panic like, oh no, let's not ruin our kids. And I just think my encouragement to parents is that when there's a rupture in a relationship, kids are really hardy to meet and repair. So when you're in that place of learning about your own attachment style that you've developed with your parents and with your relationships, and you're now raising your own kids, just to be mindful that what I think is a beautiful representation of what happens in our relationship with God can happen in your relationship with kids through repairing when there's been a brokenness moment or a rupture or something that needs to be amended, to be proactive in doing that, which helps your kids actually develop secure attachments with you as parents.
I've heard like two different percentages on this, and you guys have heard it too. But most recently, I heard as a parent, if you can get it right, so to speak, 30% of the time, that's good enough.
Mm.
And it's the idea of like good enough parenting. You don't have to be perfect, but you have to be good enough. And then engage in the when there's a rupture to repair, and those kind of rhythms can help, but no parent can get it perfect.
No. As you're talking about these different attachment styles, I can hear a tendency, if we don't understand what's influenced our own attachment style, I can hear some bad theology coming out of this. Yeah. Just, not wanting to show emotions, not wanting to be, not wanting to recognize our emotions in relationship to God, or wanting to be, or having a tendency to be anxious and wanting to make sure like we're doing the right thing to make God happy with us, to make sure everything kind of lines up and falls the way they should. And just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
I, yes, yes, yes. I think there is a lot, and I want to underline a lot
Yes.
of theology, whether it's specific written kind of systematic theology, or it's the kind of practical theology that ends up getting preached and discipled, people are discipled with. I think often people who theologians, teachers who have not interacted with their own stuff end up putting those attachment styles into the way that they teach and disciple. And so then you have someone who's coming, just to make it real simple, coming into the church with a fear-based attachment style, and they hear, you better make God happy. And they're like, oh, yes. And they're drawn to that, like, moths to the flame, because it's like, that's speaking their attachment style. Or the shame-based, you are dirty and nasty, and God is so good that he puts up with your just gross, filthy soul, right? And I'm exaggerating only a little bit, but people with a shame-based attachment style hear that and they think, oh, this is what I've been longing for. And then even the shutdown. If someone was taught in their family you can't feel emotions, and then you come into church and you hear, well, faith is all about not giving into your emotions. In fact, emotions are bad. You should never even interact with your emotions. The best thing is to never, is just to trust. Then again, that attachment style, you're drawn to that, and that just feels so right. And so what's interesting is when you start to see it through that lens, you realize, oh my gosh, there's a lot of what has happened in people's discipleship that has not only not helped them in their attachment and bonding to God, it's reinforced these unhealthy, insecure attachment styles in ways that it makes them feel like, of course, yes, I'm horrible and I've got to keep God happy and I shouldn't feel things. And so I feel like those three things, it's like a trifecta that we find in a lot of churches and a lot of how people have been discipled.
Yeah. Well, we were just talking when we were together at our conference this past week, talking about who we would like to hear historically, like a pastor giving a sermon or something. And James, you mentioned Jonathan Edwards, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, kind of jokingly. And, we all read that at some point in school, kind of like, wow, he was an angry man. But I think there's the undercurrent of that a lot in the current, at least American church, of like, I mean, he loves you, but barely. He's putting up with you. And
That's right.
you're just barely hanging on with him. And I hope you remember that every day.
It's moving more
Yeah.
towards fire insurance than healthy attachment.
Yeah.
And the message, I think it's when I over the last couple of years, when I really started to interact with some of these things and see, wow, these insecure attachment styles show up over and over again in the church. I really I got angry personally, just what happened, and I began to just unpack for me personally how I experienced some of that. And it, it's 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 tragic because some of these messages are so not good news. They are not gospel. They are not the message of a God who is crazy about you and delights in you. And I think, of course, it's true that we have sin. You know, that seems clear in the scriptures. But I think even the way that we define sin as all about action and behaviors rather than the posture of your heart comes out of insecure attachment styles. And so it is incredibly tragic that some of these things have gone unexamined because it really turns the gospel into bad news. It's not the good news that I really believe that God intended was for us to know that God is passionate about us. He delights in us. He loves us. And this led to some work that I have done over the last year in the Song of Songs and understanding that the primary picture that we find in Scripture of God's love for his people, both corporately and individually, is that of marriage. And we find it throughout the scriptures, all through the Old Testament. And then it comes into the New Testament as well, both with Jesus and into the epistles. And it's this, it's this covenant, passionate love that we see between husband and wife is God wants to say, that's how I feel about you. And that's the good news. And it's hard to think of that as good news or to think of it in that way when insecure attachment styles are informing the way that we're viewing.
I think a lot of times we can get lost in the weeds. Ultimately, people are trying to get their needs met. And I think that's how some of these unhealthy attachment styles develop, is particularly when you're young, you don't have another mechanism of getting your needs met. When they're not being met, we resort to some unhelpful behaviors in order to try to do that, whether that need is love or even practical needs like food, attention, care. So even as adults, I'm thinking we could probably even identify particular trends in certain demographics of churches or denominations towards some of these unhealthy attachment styles. And I know it's not ever, I think, malintended. It's just, people that are navigating a broken world and trying to understand it in themselves and get their needs met. What do we do with this?
Right. I was listening to a different podcast last night and they were talking about, the fear of hell compelling people. And it's like, you're running away from a bad instead of like the shift of looking toward a good and looking toward this all loving, all encompassing God. And I think that shift is like such a beautiful shift if we can get our minds around it. But I think the fear of hell compels us so much more than the love of God. Like when we get down to how we interact with church and ministry and such, fear of hell for ourselves. Like, did we say the prayer right? the 10th time or the 100th time? Or like, if I don't do this ministry right, like for cross-cultural workers, this fear of what's going to happen to the people that I'm working with too, instead of turning toward this secure, good God.
Absolutely. I think the idea is that God is good, that he's holding all things, that he's involved in all things is so it's so beautiful and it's so foundational and it gets tested all the time. We could say that we believe that God is quote sovereign, however we would understand that, and that he's involved in all things and he's present with us. But functionally, often we have a theology, a lived out theology that God is far away and we need to act in certain ways to get him to come close, or that would allow us to get close to him, rather than the idea that he is with us, he is present, he is abiding, he is loving. And if we're not experiencing that, perhaps it's just that we've turned and looked at something else. It's not. I think Meister Eckhart said, "It's not God who's gone out for a walk; it's us." And God is there. He is waiting. And I mean, the prodigal son is just that picture of God will not force himself on us. In fact, he'll give us the freedom. But man, it's like the picture of the prodigal son and father is, as soon as we like just look God's way, it's like, oh, he's there. And that's a picture I get in that parable that Jesus told. It was like almost this cartoon of, whoa, it's just God is there and doesn't even listen to the confession that the son wants to give. Because the son's like, oh, if I say this and that, and he's calculating everything. And he's thinking, if I do this all right and whatever. And the father's like, no, 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 no. Come on in, come on in. And so what do we do with this, James? I think is what you were asking. I think part of it is we have to start doing some uncomfortable things, which is, in some ways, looking at a God and relating to a God who genuinely, unconditionally is with us. And most, I think, good Christian boys and girls would, say they believe in the unconditional love of God. And yet, practically, there's a lot of conditions on experiencing his love. Or when we say unconditional love, love is like this almost generic umbrella that is not relational. So yeah, he unconditionally loves me, just like, because he has to, because he's God. But his love in the sense of his passion and delight in us, his presence with us, that's what's unconditional, not some positional sort of reality. And so I think we have to start to confront that in our relationship with God, and then begin to look at our relational patterns with others as well. And, when I'm struggling in my connection with someone, the way I'm relating to someone, to ask the question, okay, what's happening inside of me in this situation? Is there something in me that is being jostled? Is there something in me that's being brought up? And then I think as we do the work with God, it can inform the work that we're doing with others relationally. And then as we do the work with others relationally, it informs the way that we're connecting with God. And I think that's why Jesus said, love God, love your neighbor, because those two things are interconnected and they both inform one another. And as we grow in one, we grow in the other, and vice versa.
I think this is really good and important work, like for cross-cultural workers to do, before we go on the field or on the field, just to recognize how our attachment styles and what's influences our relationships with the people we're working with and the people we're working together with too. Because the relationships on the field can tend to be so intense. And especially for the people that we're working for, like we're trying to, interact with or reach or whatever, everything feels so high stakes. And so everything feels so monumental and important. And I think it would be such a gift for ourselves and for them to be able to step back and look at ourselves and like, what's informing our ideas about how we reach these people here? What are my ideas about God and how is that influencing how I'm interacting with these people?
Yeah, I'm going to say something that I hope can be taken for what it is, and I'll say it if it's God doesn't need us
Preach it. Yeah.
He doesn't need our help. He doesn't need us to reach the lost. And so whatever ministry we're involved in, he doesn't need us. He wants us. He wants us to partner with him in what he's doing. And so is all the stuff we're doing high stakes? I mean, of course it is, but we're not the stakeholders. It's God's work, it's his business, and he invites us to participate with him. And we and the other thing I'll say, we can't mess it up. We can't mess it up. We can do dumb things. We can do things that God has to work around. You know,
He's sighing like, okay, here we go
Yeah.
again.
but God uses everything, and he will, you know, and so I think sometimes we put so much pressure on ourselves, like, oh my gosh, if I don't do this, who will? Have you ever heard sermons like that? If you don't go, who's going to go? If you don't do it, who will? And it's like, well, somebody will do it if you don't do it. And if you don't do it, God's not going to hate you.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
you might be missing an opportunity to grow in a depth of relationship with God by going into a mission field that's difficult and hard and seeing God work and all the things that you're going to experience in this depth of relationship with God. You would miss on those things, but God can use someone else. God can do it on his own. He's not dependent on us. He's chosen in a sense to be dependent on us, but not in an ultimate way. And I think for all ministry workers, it's just good to not take ourselves so seriously and just realize that we're in this by invitation, and it's a gracious invitation. And God just delights in doing life with us, and that's really what any ministry is we're getting to join God in what He's doing. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's part of how I think about these things.
To me, it's this idea of attachment to God is core in our theology of work. All that you're just describing. I think of the cross culture workers I meet with, at least in the last year, nearly all of them I've asked, "What does God want from you?" And it's hard, I think, to sometimes boil it down to that. What is that big calling? It's to love God, to love others, to be with God, enjoy Him forever, and in these things that we get lost at. It's not about the numbers or about the supporters or making everybody happy but I think there's just this tendency to get lost in that. And it's really more of an attachment with God issue than it is a what work am I actually doing issue.
It feels like the stakes are so high when we're working in ministry, cross-cultural work, that you look at everything through this spiritual lens of like, oh my gosh, this is so important. Oh my gosh, that's so important. Oh, that's so important too. And I can't let that go. And I can't let that go. And it's like you said, Ted, God really doesn't need us. It's like the sweet privilege to walk along with him and see, understand his view of cultures and worlds and his love for people and how he's created them. But we're not as necessary as we tend to think we are.
Right. Yeah. And often we get attached to cultural ways of thinking about work, to your point, James. And so it's all about the numbers. And I've got to be able to put in my quarterly numbers and basically prove my worth. And if it's not to people that I'm reporting to within my organization, it's to ministry supporters. So I better have a good prayer letter. I better have a good email. I better be able to show that I'm worth it. And those are real pressures. Those are real pressures that are felt. And yet I look at the scriptures and I think if we're going to let the scriptures in any way inform the way that we think about work and ministry, most of the prophets were failures
By our standards.
compared to like Western standards, right? I mean, they didn't have numbers. Most of them were killed. Most of them were, and they were killed by their own people,
Yeah. Jeremiah.
So, yeah, I mean, I think sometimes we have to take a really hard look at those things and not be afraid to say, well, I'll give you an example. And I think I can say this because I've had this conversation multiple times, but there's been one of our board members, and we now laugh about it, but he would say to me, so what are we going to do to grow the ministry this next year? What are we going to do? And I'd say, we're not doing anything. The answer is nothing. We're not going to do anything. And he'd go, oh, okay, yeah, you're right. Yeah. Okay. And then probably the next year he'd say, okay, so what are we going to do this year to grow the ministry? And I said, nothing. And he goes, oh, yeah. And I think it has to be about 3 years in a row. Because I'm like, we're not going to do anything to try to grow the ministry. What we're going to do is, with all our hearts, seek to notice what God's doing and be responsive to what we see him doing, what we see him inviting. Our goal is not to grow. And I can tell, as a ministry, we've grown, and I can report on that and share that with people, but it doesn't come from a place of we're trying to hit certain metrics or we're trying to hit certain goals. Our goal is to be responsive to what God is doing. And I think sometimes in ministry, especially these kind of ministries where we're raising funds and we're, reporting to a board or to an organization, I think sometimes we have to be bold and say, I'm being responsive to God, and he is the one who I report to. And I know that could sort of get messed up, and that could come from a rebellious place or like not wanting to be accountable. So you have to be careful, because you can, I think, use that in unhealthy ways. But I think in a very pure, healthy way, even within structures where you're accountable, and those are good things to have human accountability. But even within that, to be able to say, ultimately, I want to be accountable in a beautiful way to what God is inviting. And I think that takes a lot of strength and courage. And to tie it back to what we're saying, it takes a secure attachment. It takes a secure attachment to God to be able to have that kind of courage and strength. And then that can allow for there to be conversations with others out of that place of secure attachment that can then also foster secure, healthy connections and attachments with those that we serve with and serve under and are serving.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Other things you think it would be helpful for churches and sending organizations to understand about attachment as they're looking at sending cross-cultural workers over field, and how this influences, the work of cross-cultural ministry?
One of the things that comes to mind, and there's probably multiple things. One of the most significant feels to me that cross-cultural workers often feel like they have to keep proving their worth over and over again, and kind of like earning their keep. And I was talking to a cross-cultural worker, global worker, a couple of weeks ago, who is on a home assignment for 6 months or something like that. And he said his home church said, we just want you to come and be here with us, and you don't have to do anything. Just come and be. If you want to, jump in and help with some things, let that come out of your desire and what the Lord is leading, but we're not going to put a bunch of stuff on you. I talked to another cross-cultural worker a couple of weeks before that who said that he came back for a year, and every Sunday he was speaking at a different church because that's what his denomination asked him to do. And so every week he was somewhere doing something. And so it feels to me like often that can be an unhealthy dynamic, is for a sending church to get a cross-cultural worker home and try to get them to have to do all this stuff instead of realizing that they need rest. And it can come out of a place then of the church feeling like that person has to prove their worth. And then that person can feel like, okay, I've got to do this. I've got to keep them happy. It could be sort of a fear-based, insecure attachment. So I think that, and then the other thing that comes to mind is just realizing that those who are cross-cultural working out in the field are humans trying to follow after God's heart. And that's why they're there. I mean, I don't think anybody ends up moving to a different culture and doing those kind of things if there's not something deeply beautiful that's going on in their heart in relationship with God. And there's still things that are not formed too. So both of those things are there. And so I think it can be easy to think that someone who is out on the field like that is like perfect and they don't have any problems and they have it all together and they're like the elite of all Christians. And that can put a lot of pressure on someone to feel like they have to live up to that and not feel like they can have problems and they can have challenges. And as you both know, the reality is being out on the field doesn't make the unformed parts that we all have any easier. In fact, it can often stir them up and make it a whole lot harder. And so often there's crisis, intense crisis that wouldn't show up back at home. And so I think for sending churches to understand that that's part of the dynamic that's really hard. So anyway, those are a couple of things that come to my mind.
And I think if we unpack some of those places that are perhaps places where we're not our best selves. So you mentioned defensiveness, people pleasing, where I always put on the happy face, where we have shame. I'm not good enough, not worthy enough, not working hard enough. I'm a bad global worker. I'm a bad, all of these things are often deeply rooted in our attachment. So I think this would be a great thing for organizations to pay attention to. So be careful of metrics and perhaps lean more into those relational things.
As we're wrapping up, Ted, do you have any resources you'd recommend for our listeners?
One of my, I've really appreciated this book is Attached to God. The author is Mayfield. It's really helpful. Another one is Summer Gross, who's a friend, has written a book on attachment, and the name of it's not right in front of me, but I think if you look up Summer Gross, you'll find her work on attachment. She just came out with it this spring. I shared with you, I've been doing some work in the Song of Songs, and I just recently put together a daily devotional that walks through the Song of Songs and looks at it from the perspective of God's love for us and informed by an understanding of attachment. In the introduction, I spent a little bit of time on attachment, but that was really the lens through which I was putting together those daily devotionals. So those are just a couple of things that I've found helpful and over the last couple of years. And then the work on Song of Solomon is something that's just been the culmination of several years of spending time with that book, and then also some reflections around attachment theory.
Sounds great.
It's been really nice talking to you today.
You too.
Ted, always good to see you. Thanks so much for being here.
Yes, you're welcome. Love you guys.
Good to see you. Take care.
Bye.
Someone is at the front door.
You can stop recording if you want. Brandy Lynn.
Lee. Those of you guys. Yeah, I mean, James can tell you I'm walking great now. No problem.
It's not the word I would use. You are walking.
Hope you can edit out those coughs.
They get on the blooper reel at the end.
Bye, have a great time.